Welcome to this week's edition of On Politics. I'm Dr. Eric Morrow at Tarleton State University, and we are broadcasting here on KTRL 90.5 FM and also online at tarletonradio.com. As you know, each week our shows are then recorded, put on SoundCloud, also where you can download your podcasts. So we encourage you to not only follow us, listen each week at noon here on KTRL, but also if you miss the broadcast, to download a podcast or to listen on SoundCloud. And also go to our Facebook page, On Politics with Eric Morrow, where you'll find links to related articles as well as information on the show each week. So welcome to this edition. We're glad you're joining us today because we are going to look at something that is certainly happening on the national level, but has a lot of impact and potential for what is happening in the state of Texas. And that is on June 15th, the Supreme Court ruled that the civil rights law, the 1964 civil rights law, applies to LGBTQ workers, granting them protections in the workplace. And so what we're doing today is we're going to dig into this a little bit. We're going to look at some of the different aspects of it, especially some of the issues and challenges here in Texas. And so I want to welcome to the show Angela Hale, who is a Dallas native, former TV reporter and veteran journalist at CBS KTVT Channel 11 in Dallas-Fort Worth. She is the managing partner of Red Media Group, a strategic communications and public affairs company. She led the communications effort for the legalization of gay marriage for the Aiken Gump law firm and Texas plaintiffs, and she's been leading lobby and communication strategies for Equality Texas since 2015. Angela has also served in executive leadership, so she has legislative experience as well, which we know is great on this show because we talk policy. But she worked in the leadership for the Speaker of the House and the Office of the Attorney General. So with all that experience, with what you currently do, Angela, we are glad that you're joining us because this is a very interesting and challenging topic. I think it's also one that as we focus on this show and trying to get information to people, that many people just may not understand all the different facets of this, what this decision means, and even what was happening that kind of led up to this. So welcome to the show today, Angela. We're glad to have you.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to start out with an initial question of just from your perspective, given your lobbying background, your work background with Equality Texas and with other efforts, what is really the significance of what happened on June 15th relating to this ruling of the Supreme Court in interpreting the 1964 Civil Rights Act?
It's a landmark decision in a series of landmark decisions that have come down from the Supreme Court in recent years, starting with marriage equality, actually the Windsor case prior to that, and now with this workplace discrimination issue. I think a lot of people did not realize previously, before the ruling, and there was a lot of publicity around this ruling, that Texas is one of 27 states where we did not have explicit protections under the law in Texas. So if I went to work and I put a picture of my wife up on my desk, I could be married in Texas, but I could also be fired from my job just because of being gay or of being transgender. And it wasn't based on work performance. So to me, that was inherently unfair. And what the Supreme Court determined with Neil Gorsuch, a Trump appointee, writing a majority opinion for the court, he said that under the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the word sex means sexual orientation and gender identity, and that all people should be afforded the same level of protection under the law, every single person in the United States. And what's significant also about that is there have been a lot of court cases going up through the different circuits. So the Fifth Circuit, the Third Circuit, the Ninth Circuit, that came up with different conclusions about whether sex, under the legal definition of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, meant it protected sexual orientation and gender identity. And the Supreme Court has ruled that indeed it does protect, and it does mean that under the Civil Rights Act, therefore people cannot be fired any longer in the United States in a very narrow decision, really on just employment issues, because there's a wide variety of other issues where people can still be discriminated against. But under employment decisions, you cannot be fired just because of who you are or who you love.
So I've noticed along that line, speaking to the last point, you said that this deals with employment issues, and some of the things I read in preparing for this interview and this really digging in myself to some aspects of this, that some are saying this is a qualified victory because there are a lot of these other areas to address. Where do you either see this going, or what are some of those critical issues that you think will be, especially on the federal level, now that the Supreme Court has ruled on this, but what are some of the other areas to see this understood within the full context of rights and not just narrowly focused on one area?
Well, I think the most important part of the decision is that determination under the Civil Rights Act that sex means sexual orientation and gender identity. This is the first time that the Supreme Court has ruled on that and upheld it. So when we see, so currently it only protects in employment, but if there's litigation on the Trump administration's implementation about healthcare or public accommodations or other areas of law, housing, the Supreme Court's interpretation on sex as sexual orientation and gender identity, that being a precedent, would apply to all those other cases and areas of law, but that would require litigation to go back up to the Supreme Court again so that it would be codified once again by the Supreme Court. It doesn't automatically apply to all those areas, but because of precedent by the Supreme Court, it can apply to all of those areas, but it will take litigation to continue up to the court to have a confirmation once again through the Supreme Court. Or the other way to get there on, if you think about, somebody on the bathroom bill. And so that's a public accommodation. Public accommodation means public spaces. If I'm going to go to a restaurant, or I want to go to a hotel, or if I want to go to a convention, or if I want to go to the bathroom at a public restroom, currently in Texas, there is no public accommodations law. There is a public accommodations law at the federal level, but bringing protections in line for people who go about their everyday lives. So they can go shopping, they can go to a mechanic, they can go, they can carry on their lives without suddenly facing discrimination. And those are areas of the law that both at the national level, there is something called the Equality Act that has been passed by the United States House of Representatives, which carries into those areas of law. And so that would take either a piece of congressional legislation passing that law, or in statewide legislation passing that law to be signed by the president, or the other route is litigation, taking all these cases up through the Supreme Court so that that same ruling that applies in employment goes across all these other areas of life where people are still discriminated against across the United States.
And we've seen that in other areas of the application of civil rights law, how that has worked over time. And it is often on multiple fronts until you have a Supreme Court case. And so that means there's a lot of different directions that this could go. I would assume probably in the immediate future, because there's probably some of these cases that are already in the mix somewhere. They just did not make it to that level yet as quickly as this collection of cases, which I understand there were 3 different cases that were ruled on. Turning this to Texas, and you're talking about all of these different areas and not having the public accommodations law. Also looking at that there's been a long history here of discrimination and challenges for those that identify as LGBTQ. Why do you see this has been such a difficult issue in Texas? And I asked that question because on the show a week ago, I had Cal Gilson, a professor at SMU, and we talked about political culture and how that's influencing how people respond to government in the midst of a pandemic that's trying to give direction and so on. I mean, is political culture in the mix here? What other elements do you see that challenge moving forward on some of these issues?
Well, I think historically, we celebrated, I guess, Juneteenth on Friday, and that was Texas finally agreeing that federal civil rights laws applied to our state. I think sometimes in the South, we might be behind on a variety of civil rights issues in southern states historically through the beginning of time and even now. I believe, though, as I've been working on this issue for a few years now, that every session when we go back to the legislature, that there's more and more support for equality for everyone under our state laws. And many Republicans that I work with in the legislature during the past session, chairs of committees. I used to work for Speaker Strauss. Speaker Strauss put out a tweet, I'm one of the 70% of Texans that support LGBTQ equality. He was very strong and helpful in making a policy decision that this was bad for our state. It's bad for business. It's bad for the brand. It's bad for Texans who are not treated equally under the law. So as each session has progressed, beginning, if you go back to the bathroom bill, where there was a lot of hostility and a lot of, I think we had to do some public education to educate people about what that meant, what a transgender woman meant, what a transgender child meant. There was a lot of education, and we were ultimately, primarily with the Business Coalition, able to defeat that twice in a regular session and a special session, and of course, with the help of key Republicans in the legislature, Byron Cook, who was chair of State Affairs, Todd Hunter, chair of Calendars, Speaker Joe Strauss, and many other Republicans. We could not have achieved where we are without them. During 2019, it was not as hostile going into many offices. In fact, many Republican lawmakers would say, look, this is not my issue. I don't want to discriminate against you. I don't think it's right. And some would say, well, I'm voting my district, and what we've tried to show through polling and really a breakdown of individual districts is that actually the vast majority of Texans, 70%, do not support discrimination and support a comprehensive non-discrimination law. And if you look at conventions that can be canceled, there are clauses and contracts for conventions now that if you, even just talking about discriminatory legislation or possibly passing it during the 2017 session, we lost billions of dollars in business on conventions that could have been booked. And there's now a little clause that says if you pass discriminatory legislation, that's an automatic cancellation of a contract. And as the coronavirus has spread all over the state, and our convention and visitor industry has taken incredible hits and lost a ton of money, it's very important to the business community to make sure that diversity and inclusion are embraced by our state, that we don't pass discriminatory legislation. And this session, because we've garnered so much bipartisan support, we still have a long way to go. Don't get me wrong, the political implications that you're talking about, it's not like every Republican is on board, or every Democrat for that matter. But we have the Texas House has always worked as kind of a governing majority, whether it was George W. Bush, who was governor, and Lieutenant Governor Bob Bullock, a Democrat, and Speaker Pete Laney. And through the years, there's always been a group in the middle, both Republicans and Democrats, who speak out, push, and work for good public policy that's in the middle, not on the extreme left or right. And that's where I think this issue is going in the future. I think we have a lot of support, and we have every session more and more people understanding that maybe didn't understand. I have people tell me all the time, I didn't understand that you could be denied entrance to a restaurant, or that you could be couldn't go to the bathroom, or that you couldn't go to a concert, or whatever it may be. People did not understand that you could be fired or you could be turned away simply because you're LGBTQ.
So I have a question that's somewhat related to that, and you had your experience working on the same-sex marriage issue, and as someone who's taught Texas government for a number of years, I used that issue for a long time as one of those social issues that was very challenging in terms of governance and policy. And then I moved over to using the transgender bathroom debate as an issue as well, to expose students to the challenges and the complexity of these issues and the different perspectives, and have them do some research and try to understand that. I remember when I was teaching on and using the same-sex marriage issue and having their discussions and debate about it, is that the polling in the state certainly did not reflect the dominant view in the state legislature. And that is, it looked like that about a third of Texans were against it. A third, it didn't really matter. They weren't necessarily for, they weren't necessarily for it, but it showed that they didn't think the government should tell people who they can marry and who they couldn't. The other third was for it. And so the legislature certainly didn't follow along those lines. And of course, we know this one was resolved by a federal court case. But where do you see this issue? You talked a little bit about the change in the legislature, and how does that align up with where the public in Texas is on this issue? Because it seems like that still has, on some of these types of issues like that, where you do have strong levels of say social conservatism in certain parts of the state, that lawmakers line up with their constituents and so on. But we've seen with these issues, there is usually more widespread support to make these changes among the electorate than there are among the people who are in office. And do you see those kind of coming together at some point here, now that a decision like this is made based on looking back at what happened with the same-sex marriage issue?
Well, I think we've made progress, and there's still a long way to go. And part of that is educating people and bringing people along. I've said this not on just this topic, but on many other topics that I work on, in the legislature, is that often the public is way ahead of where the legislature is. And business on this issue, diversity and inclusion in the workplace at Fortune 500 companies has been embraced for 20 to 30 years by every corporation almost in America, and by most small businesses and medium-sized businesses, even though technically they're not, required to do it. It is just a way that you do business to attract the best and brightest talent. And so I think the legislature always has to catch up, both in technology, and embracing technology that's implemented at the state government system, and in moving into a 21st century thinking about what diversity and inclusion means. And so, we've made progress. I think we'll make more progress in the next session. I still think it's going to be multiple sessions and a while to take this toward true equality for every person. But each the legislature moves in increments, and I always look at it as it's the long game. So we keep making progress each session to a point that we get to true equality. But I believe that the Texas public, and these public opinion polls have been going up and up over the years very rapidly, especially since marriage equality came down from the Supreme Court. But even prior to that, I'm a native Texan. I grew up in Dallas. I'm just like your typical Texan, that Texans are respectful. They don't believe in discriminating against people, treating people unequally. There's a sense of fairness among Texans, and that's what I think is reflected in the polls. And I think going back, and even some of our legislators who come from very conservative areas, Senator Kel Zeliger from Amarillo, for instance, last session voted with us for the first time in the Texas Senate, a Republican, to vote against discriminatory legislation, SB 17, which would enable people to discriminate across all walks of life and every occupation against people just because they're LGBTQ. Senator Zeliger is Jewish. I think that could have allowed discrimination against our Jewish friends or other religious minorities, and so maybe it's meant to target just LGBTQ people, but it ends up having a broad cross-section that also discriminates against other people in our state. And so I think that, we continue to gain support from people that maybe some people wouldn't think are supportive of these issues, but when you sit down and talk to them, everybody is pretty reasonable, especially the coalition, the governing coalition in the middle that's always been the Texas legislature.
All right, so we saw that in the previous session with just the economic influences related to the bathroom bill and just how the different things that went through and the different groups that came out against that, especially in looking at it and its impact economically. We know this next session is going to be really focused on, first and foremost, probably the state budget, because here I am at a state institution and we're already seeing the impact, at least on this cycle, and then what will happen going forward. But there are always a couple of signature issues that rise to the forefront in addition to the budget. Do you see this or related issues, and what type of focus, what type of specific issues do you think will be, and what you're looking at in the work you're doing as well, to be on the agenda for this upcoming session that'll begin in January?
Well, we will be facing, a deficit budget because of the coronavirus and all the loss in sales tax revenue, which is one of the major funders of the budget. Last session, they put $5 billion into education from the state level. Mm-hmm. They've been severely underfunded. And so that's going to be a problem moving to this next session, funding properly education at the state level. And what I find very interesting about the issue that we're talking about today is that we have hired Ray Perryman, who is one of the most respected economists. He's in Texas and in the United States. He worked for George W. Bush when he was governor. He worked for Rick Perry. He has the Perryman Group. He's done numerous economic studies. And he has done a study. We asked him to conduct a study on what are the benefits of passing a comprehensive non-discrimination law through the Texas legislature in the next session. And we've unveiled the study, and I'm happy to send that to you so that you can, send it out to your listeners and have them look at it. But what his determination is that embracing diversity and inclusion, passing a statewide non-discrimination law, will create hundreds of thousands of jobs across the state of Texas, across every area of the state, from rural Texas to East Texas to Panhandle down to South Texas. By 2025, if it were passed during the next session, we'd create 180,000 new jobs statewide. We would also bring in, and this gets back to the deficit budget, an extra $2.8 billion in state tax receipts to the budget, and an additional $2 billion to local governments. And by 2045, if it were endorsed, it would create over 700,000 jobs, bring almost $74 billion to the state budget, and $56 billion to local governments. So this is something that the legislature, as we've lost millions of jobs, we try to recover our economy, we try to help bring in revenues that's going to build so that we can spend money on things like education and transportation and important public policy areas. By embracing diversity and inclusion, it gives Texas the competitive edge to compete on a global basis and to create hundreds of thousands of jobs, bring revenue to state and local governments, bring in about $20 billion in annual tech and tourism gross product just in 5 years, and $1.3 trillion in 20 years. So it's a win-win for the economy, and we plan to make that case to legislators as we move forward as part of the discussion on how to help the budget and how to do the right thing to protect all Texans so that no one is discriminated against in the next session. And that's why we've conducted this study and why it will be a top priority for us and our business coalition and a wide variety of people moving into the next session.
That seems like in the environment we're in, especially the fiscal policy environment, that would be very appealing, because one of the challenges is always in the state legislature is not only not proposing any new taxes in the era that we're in and the way people are looking at this, but trying to find ways to generate additional revenue. And it seems like that messaging, and certainly the way that you put it, would be very appealing for those that would be looking at the other side of it. Okay, we're in a state that runs a bare bones budget, spends less per capita on government than any other state. How do we find ways to recover out of this? I also want to ask about specific policy areas. Do you see, based on this decision, that it's optimal time to move forward on maybe housing, or what are other areas that you would see that may be more aligned with state and even federal law in trying to advance the rights in those areas, in addition to what's happened here looking at the workplace?
So a comprehensive bill under the Perryman study includes employment, housing, and public accommodation. So we're looking at those three areas of law to be encompassed by a comprehensive bill, with the study as the backbone of what passing those three areas of law would do and help the Texas economy, therefore also protecting LGBTQ people in those other areas of law, and codifying into state law employment, because you talked about marriage equality and the bathroom bill. And so it's important that it's also codified in state law, because you've seen litigation when people don't want to accept what the Supreme Court has done. Therefore, it's important to also codify it in state law.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us today. This is very informative in looking at what has happened and understanding this decision of the Supreme Court as not only a landmark decision, but really moving this in a direction in a number of ways. Seem to see, and especially in what you're saying, is that if Texas is able to move forward with this on the legislative agenda and address some of these issues, that Texas could be join kind of some of the leading states in the level of accommodations, in the view of this in terms of civil rights and the opportunities for LGBTQ people. Is that where you see this? I know you look at it for the long term, and I know Texas can be a very challenging place to work in terms of policy, with a part-time legislature and then other factors you work against. But how do you see this in the coming years?
Well, I think throughout history, at least in recent history, since I've worked for Greg Abbott when he was Attorney General, and I worked for Speaker Strauss, and I was a reporter during the Rick Perry era and George W. Bush era. And one thing that's been consistent throughout all of these gubernatorial leaders has been keeping the Texas economy number one in the nation to do business. And as we have implemented new things along the way, other states copy us and catch up to us. And so this is yet another way, from how I look at it, for Texas to continue to be the leader in innovation, in business activity, in job creation, and continue to be the number one state for doing business. And I'm confident that as we move forward, that we will get a coalition of people who are going to understand that, who care about the economy on both sides of the aisle, and are going to try to help us achieve these goals. I hope to accomplish them as soon as possible in the next legislative session, and I believe we'll make significant progress in the next legislative session. I hope to go all the way. If we don't make it all the way in the next session, I feel like by the following legislative session that we would be able to achieve what we're talking about. But I also have a lot of confidence that we can achieve great progress in the 2021 session.
I've been speaking with Angela Hale, who has led communications efforts for the legalization of gay marriage, and has been a leading lobby and communication strategist for Equality Texas since 2015. Angela, I want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
We will take a short break, and we will be back after the break with more on politics.
Ever find yourself wishing you didn't have to miss your favorite radio show? Well, wish no more because KTRL 90.5 FM is now streaming online. Tune in to catch your favorite broadcasts and shows live right at home from your computer or mobile device. To listen, please visit tarletonradio.com or click Listen Live at ktrl.fm.
Politics can be confusing, but On Politics with Eric Morrow has your back. Follow the show on Facebook. Search On Politics with Eric Morrow to stay up to date with the show and all the sources to follow right along.
Welcome back to On Politics. I'm Dr. Eric Morrow, and we want to thank again Angela for joining us with the interview regarding the recent Supreme Court decisions on workplace protections for persons who identify as LGBT or Q. We will track that issue and look at what happens in the next legislative session, especially with the focus and the agenda that she laid out in terms of trying to influence public accommodation laws in Texas. So on another related topic that I want to look at is one that I've given some attention to and research over the years, and actually has seen some movement in the halls of the legislature, and that is the issue of sex education in public schools. This issue has, while it's been out there, while it continues to be controversial and challenging in the state, it has been over 2 decades. So it's been since 1997 since the state has revised any of its policies regarding sex and health education. And now they're going through a process of review and looking at recommendations to make some changes. And so as with some other social issues that are very similar, especially what we talked about in the first half of the show, this issue has always been and continues to be very, very controversial in the state, primarily because of the way the law is structured, the way it's focused, and really looking at what Texas does in comparison with other states across the country. So this past week, members of the Texas State Board of Education began a process of taking testimony to look at support for various changes that are being considered. Now, before we get into that and before we talk about some of the different views that are trying to influence those outcomes, one of the things that we need to do is understand what the current law is in Texas and what guidance the law provides to public school districts. And you have to remember, in Texas, we have independent public school systems, so independent districts. I always ask my students in the classroom when we're focusing on local government, why do we call them independent school districts? And what are they independent from? And they all kind of look at me like, what are you talking about? Even though they went to a public school and that name was used, it's on our buses, it's in the name of the school district. And no one usually can tell me, but that goes back to the post-Reconstruction Constitution of the state, with the focus of returning control of public education at the local level to local communities. And so the independent is actually independent from the state. So we have this long history of local public education being just that, being local, being controlled by local school boards. And to a certain degree that has remained in place, even though that we see certain standards in terms of testing, teacher certification standards, and many other things that are directed by the Texas Education Agency, we still see a level of autonomy or independence, we could say, that local school districts have. And that is really what is represented in the current laws on health and sexuality education, as we would say, in public schools. And so just a quick overview of that, just so that people understand what the law says. You can find this in the Texas Education Code, Section 28. It is in Section 004 that deals with local school health advisory councils and health education instruction. And really this law comes out of a perspective that sex education is connected to health education. But we'll see that that doesn't really hold through except in kind of the standards and the way that the state has wanted school districts to address this issue. So the law requires public schools to teach health education, including a parenting and paternity awareness program. And local school districts are free to kind of develop their health education program in partnership with what is called in the law a local school health advisory council. So each school district has to develop one of these councils that in the law, and this is what the law itself says, helps to ensure that community values are reflected in the instruction. So you can see that this is very much at the local level. It is focused on the advisory council that then offers guidance to the school district on what reflects the values in that community. School districts are not permitted to change health education policies or to choose to teach sexuality and HIV/AIDS education without considering the input of this local council. So again, here we have something that is very much connected to the way we've done public education in this state, especially with the focus on the independent aspect of it, that local schools have a certain amount of say and control. Of course, the law here is directing them how to do it. It's saying have a local advisory council that then has input and recommendations on what should be taught in that specific school. So the local school health advisory council is there to assist the district with interpreting or applying what they see are local community values, and that those values are reflected in the district's health education instruction. Regarding sex education or human sexuality, pregnancy, disease prevention, and so on, these are the guidelines that come out of the law that influence how school districts adopt a curriculum and approach these topics. So they must present sexual abstinence as the preferred behavior for unmarried students. The second thing is that they focus more on abstinence than on any other behavior. And then third, they emphasize that consistent abstinence before marriage is the only method that is 100% effective in preventing pregnancy, STDs, HIV/AIDS, and, quote, the emotional trauma associated with adolescent sexual activity. Okay, so that's actually in the law itself. So we've got two features here, the Health Advisory Council. Then we've got the guidelines, which are very much focused on abstinence-based education. And then you have the final one, and that is that parental notification. And in the law itself, it requires districts that choose to teach human sexuality. So again, this is there's guidelines and there's direction and there's a framework, but it's not required that every district do this the same way. There's not a uniform education across the state, but those that choose to do that must provide instructional materials for public review, and then parents and guardians must be notified of material content and their right to deny such instruction. So the parents can opt out. They can opt their student out of this education depending on the content and what they see in terms of its value. So what we see here are a lot of guidelines that are, and really because it's in the kind of directives based on the law of how districts can go about doing this. And so this topic has continued to be challenging in the state. One is because Texas has one of the highest teen pregnancy rates in the country. So when you look at Texas compared to other states, we definitely see some challenges there. The data also shows that approximately 40% of Texas high school students report having had sex in the recent past, but less than half of those used condoms, and a small percentage used birth control pills. And so the data just shows this high rate of teen pregnancy. So on the one side, you have advocates and people who've said this abstinence-based education or limited health education with very little attention to human sexuality is not sufficient. It creates other challenges because of the high rate of sexual activity among high school students, as well as the lack of knowledge about using prevention methods and so forth. So this has been gaining attention over decades now. And part of the reason in reviewing this is to look at how sex education and the options there in this law can be expanded to give more directive to school districts about moving beyond abstinence-based education. Right now in the state, there are only 17% of Texas school districts that are teaching abstinence plus. So that means that they're not just teaching about abstinence, but they're also teaching about other aspects of this, including prevention, including disease prevention, as well as safe sex practices and so on. And so 17%, if you look at that across the state with, given the number of school districts that we have, I think there's approximately 1,200 school districts, and you see the challenges here, and then the challenges that brings among our teenage population, as well as the other related healthcare needs and issues, you can see that this is quite a significant issue. So we go back to what the Texas State Board of Education is doing with these hearings. And so this past week, over 200 people registered to speak at these hearings, and they were able to hear about 40 of them. And they were focused very much on how to expand the boundaries in what they are teaching. And so the boundaries itself are, as we described in the law, very kind of narrowly defined or very narrowly focused on abstinence-based and promoting that above all things. But what's being considered is should the requirement be expanded so that there is additional education that's offered on safe practices, as well as disease prevention and pregnancy prevention and so on. This is where kind of the focus is. There are not any, there's not anything in the draft proposal that at this point that addresses issues of sexual orientation or gender identity. So here we have a connection with the first part of the show today, and that is that there are many who are advocating that there should be more. It shouldn't just not be expanding sex education in terms of safe practices and prevention, as much as it should also include dealing with issues and education about gender identity and sexual orientation. That adds to the controversy. And this is why I'm focusing on this issue today and trying to make it explain it a little bit more in detail, because it's a very multifaceted issue that has both supporters and opponents on both sides and coming at it from many different ways. And so we've had for a long time now, we've had many people advocating that it needed to be broadened, that sex education needs to be broadened. And really, when you look at polls, I think it's about 78% of the public now, public opinion polls in Texas, there's support for broadening sex education in public schools. About 65% of those in the legislature, especially, and I think this is among those who identify as Republican, that might have more conservative views on this issue, see that it needs to be broadened just because of the challenges of the role of governance and government in addressing some of these issues, especially dealing with teen pregnancy and other things as well. So there seems to be growing support to expand this. The challenge is that you have some very vocal opponents, and those opponents are in two primary areas, or they have two different elements of opposition here. One element of opposition is the focus on abstinence-based education. So you have a number of groups and a number of people that their focus is on maintaining that in our education system, it's not the responsibility of school districts and teachers to teach sex education other than to focus on abstinence, and that other elements of that are things that are more appropriate to be addressed by parents, guardians, and within the home. So this has been a long-standing argument related to sex education, and it's one that continues to come to the forefront. In fact, some of the people who testified before the Texas State Board of Education continue to advocate in this way, that nothing needs to be changed. If in fact anything, it needs to be even tighter in its focus on abstinence-based education. The other side of this, and this is really what I don't see is even on the table at this point because it's not being considered in the drafts of the revisions, and that is dealing with gender identity and sexual orientation. And so this even becomes more controversial. And as we were talking about in the first half of the show and looking at workplace protections and some of the challenges in the state related to protections that for people who identify as LGBTQ, as well as dealing with these broader issues of gender identity and sexual orientation, there remains very strong opposition in that regard. And I think we would probably see more of that in this mix if the drafts had any inclination that there was going to be gender identity or sexual orientation dealt with or allowance for that, directive for that. And you see, part of this we have to understand is the law provides some boundaries and it provides some direction, but there's a lot of latitude there in what school districts can do. And so we see a lot of diversity around the state, and those schools that have tried to move further along this spectrum of a broader sex education have engaged with much more opposition than other districts that have really kind of left it alone and under the direction of their advisory councils have limited what they're doing in the classroom. And so that's where I want to take a moment here in this process and in discussing this issue to look at Texas compared to the rest of the country. And one of the things that we have to understand in this is that one, it's how Texas appears on paper in terms of what the law says and what school districts can do, but also look at the reality of it. And we've looked at the reality to say, okay, only 17% of our school districts are doing abstinence plus education, even though Texas, if you look at it in comparison with many other states, allows certain things, but it doesn't necessarily require these things. The first and foremost requirement is certainly health education, and that if there is human sexuality education, that focuses on abstinence under the direction of these local advisory councils. So one of the places that I go, and I would just recommend this to you on many of these social issues, is the website of the Guttmacher Institute. So that's GUTTMACHER.org. And I will put this on our Facebook site so that you can link to it and see on this issue and many others as well. But when we look at the information there, we can see that there are 39 states and the District of Columbia that mandate sex education and or HIV education. 30 states mandate that when provided, sex and HIV education programs meet certain general requirements. And then 40 states require school districts to involve parents in sex education, HIV education, or both. Now, when we go to the comparative, when we look at Texas alongside other states, you can see that the boxes are checked. Is sex education mandated? Yes. Is HIV education mandated? Yes. We skip over and we talk about when provided, sex education must be medically accurate. No, there's no language that addresses that. Be age appropriate? Yes. Be culturally appropriate and unbiased? Again, there's no guidance on that. Cannot promote religion. There's no restriction on that, where you do have some religious traditions that would promote abstinence. Is where that falls in line. Parental consent, yes, they must be given notice and the opportunity to opt out if they do not want their child to participate in that education. The other part of this, when we look at other parts of the state, is that content requirements, contraception, yes, that can be taught. Again, only 17% of districts are moving beyond the basic abstinence-focused sex education. Abstinence stressed in Texas, yes. importance of sex only within marriage? Yes. Sexual orientation? No, that's not addressed at all. Condoms? Yes. Abstinence? Yes. When provided, this is talking about HIV education now. And then finally, the last data set, and again, I'll link to this so that you can look at it, and that is sex education to include life skills on sexual consent, relationships, and prevention of violence. Texas, yes, emphasize healthy relationships. Yes, emphasize sexual decision-making and self-discipline. Yes, refusal skills and personal boundaries. Consent is not necessarily a part of it. Dating and sexual violence prevention is. So you can see on the national scale, Texas checks a lot of the boxes, but when you look at the way that this is implemented within the state, and you see that these local advisory councils based on community values is in place, and we've talked about that's the case, this becomes a much more complicated and certainly much more diverse in how this is approached throughout the state. So where I would leave this is, and we'll wait the decision of the State Board of Education, which will be in November, to finalize this new guidance. But where we leave with this is that there is support for broadening sex education in the state. The support for focusing more, giving more attention to gender identity and sexual orientation is not as strong, but there is attention being given to this issue and some movement on it after many, many years and many school districts trying to address these issues primarily at the local level under the guidance provided by the state. I want to thank you for joining us today for this edition of On Politics. Invite you to be back with us next week. We are going to have at least one guest and maybe two where we'll be looking at the challenges related to statues and memorials during this current focus on racial injustice and other issues. Again, thank you for joining us, and we will see you again at this time on KTRL FM 90.5 next week.
This has been a Tarleton Radio Network podcast with production from AJ Heyer and Taylor Welch. Find more great shows by searching Tarleton Radio Network wherever you get your podcasts.